they came not as one people, but as many. Saxons, Angles, Jutes, drifters across the sea, carving kingdoms from the ashes of Rome. No one called it England, not yet. It was a land of broken tribes and rising powers, where oaths were forged in blood and crowns were taken, not given. From the chaos of the Viking raids to the thunder of Norman hooves at Hastings, a new world was born, rooted in faith, forged in war, ruled by kings and built by the hands of countless forgotten souls. This is the story behind the English civilization in Age of Empires 4, where every arrow, castle, and crown carries the weight of 1,000 years. Bows, farms, and navy. Three characteristic elements of this iconic civilization, the English. A powerful civilization with a rich history full of kings and queens, rebellions, revenge, and conquest. In Age of Empires 4, you get to build up the civilization from the years 850 to 1555. Britain is a multicultural island, and the population actually is made up mostly from migratory people like Saxons, Angles, and Jutes. And Anglo would come to refer to all Germanic speakers in the island, including different dialects. To these people, there was no England nor the concept of the English yet. And the Old English still had to form as a standard language. The Anglo-Saxon period in England began with the withdrawal of the Roman Empire from the lands in 410. They had to go back to their mainland to protect Rome from the Visigoths. And after that, Britannia, as the Romans would call it, retained the Roman-style cities and architecture and even the culture. However, the island remained after that completely isolated from the mainland, from the continent, and was not in the main trade route. It had no access to products from the continent. And we don't even have that many historical records of this time either. It's like a black box period of time in England history. By the mid-400s, some Jute mercenaries from what's now Denmark showed up to help some local rulers. But instead of just helping, they ended up taking land for themselves. And not long after, other Germanic tribes like the Angles started doing the same and setting up their own kingdoms. By the 7th century, the old Roman province of Britannia had been completely reshaped. It was now split into 7 Germanic kingdoms, and most of the native and Roman British people had either been pushed out or absorbed into this new order. With an estimate of 200,000 Angles and Jutes and Saxons settled in England, this marks the beginning of the Anglo-Saxon period, which lasts until the Norman Conquest in 1066. In Age of Empires 4, the English civilization is represented from 850 to 1555, and 850 falls exactly in the Anglo-Saxon era, more specifically, the Viking era. We also see at this point the first recorded long-lasting stay of Vikings in England. England was on the brink of dramatic changes that would lead to warfare, Norse settlements, and eventually to a unified English kingdom. Until the 8th century, the English society was organized or structured in a pre-feudal aristocracy. And that means that power was based more in personal loyalty, kingship, or even bloodlines. And wealth was based on movable assets, such as gold and cattle and so on. So a warrior might follow a lord just because he protected his family, or gave him a sword, or let him share in raids, for example. However, if that lord lost prestige or became weak, the warrior might just switch his allegiance to someone else. So there were no legal contracts. Everything was based on reputation, on honor, and personal bonds. These informal relationships were how power was organized before feudalism made everything structured and land-based. Feudalism slowly or gradually replaced the old system as rulers and monarchs needed a more stable territorial control. England began to be called England between the 7th and the 10th century during the Anglo-Saxon invasions. In the game, an important bonus of this civilization already available in the Dark Ages is farming. Farms positioned near mills have a gathering rate bonus, and that scales by age. In 850, cereals such as barley, rye, wheat, and oats were the most important crops for food and drink. These crops supported a self-sufficient agrarian society and were central in the society's survival and daily life. And cereal grain cultivation in England goes way back to the Neolithic period, about 4000 before current era. A unique feature of this civilization is the fact that they cannot produce spears in Dark Ages, but men-at-arms. This is actually a quite interesting decision made by the developers, as men-at-arms, they were most prominent during High and Late Middle Ages. So these soldiers were professional warriors with heavy armor that would serve a lord or a king. In 850, the military system in England depended more on soldiers on demand. So if something happens and they are needed, they would fight. These forces were called fyrd, which sounds very much like a Viking word, doesn't it? And these men were simply free men that were obligated to fight during a certain period of time in the year. The men-at-arms concept developed after the Norman Conquest especially, meaning after 1066, when the feudal military system became the norm. When King Edward the Confessor died in 1066, he died childless, and there was no clear heir to the throne, and that led to a dispute. Harold Godwinson, the most powerful English aristocrat, claimed that Edward named him heir on his deathbed, but Harold was challenged by two neighbors, William of Normandy and Tostig Godwinson. William claimed that King Edward promised him the throne and that Harold actually even knew about it. Tostig was Harold's exiled brother, and he allied with King Harald Hardrada, who claimed that Edward's predecessor and the King of Norway had already an agreement putting him as successor to the English and Norway's thrones. Everything happens quite fast now. In the same year, 1066, the Norwegian invasion begins. Tostig and King Harald actually took control of the northern England, defeating two earls in York. And King Harold crossed the country, rushed with his forces towards the north to defend his lands from these invaders. And he is successful. He defeats them at the Battle of Stamford Bridge. Both Harold and Tostig were killed in the battle, and only 24 out of 300 ships, Norwegian ships, were necessary to take the survivors away. It looks good for Harold, right? But the costs were too high. While Harold was fighting the Norwegian forces in the north, William lands in the south with an army from Normandy and France. After defending the north from Harald and Tostig, Harold left most of his forces in the north, and the remaining forces were exhausted from the recent fights. And not only that, from the traveling, they are literally crossing the country from top to bottom twice. Harold, however, his magnificent plan was to surprise William in the south. But he was scouted. See the importance of scouting? That's why you scout your enemy? Harold then took a defensive position at the top of the Senlac Hill, not too far from William's castle at Hastings. The Battle of Hastings is the first campaign of the Normans that you can actually play in the Age of Empires 4. It's really hard to find accurate reports of this battle, but it's important to remember to keep in mind that history is written by victors. What we have today that show us the events that led up to the Norman Conquest is the Bayeux Tapestry, a 70-meter long cloth embroidered with 58 scenes, including the Battle of Hastings. The army numbers were most likely similar, and although Harold had the high ground advantage, his men didn't have much space to fight because of the forests that they had around them. And in the end, William had a superior cavalry, maybe because, it was a French cavalry, and the cavalry was able to navigate the battlefield way better. Plus, he had many archers with him, and Harold only had infantry and a few archers. And of course, the cherry on the cake, they were extremely tired from crossing the country over and over again. It was a decisive victory for William, and Harold's body was found in the battleground on the next day, and from there William marches towards London, where he's crowned King of England in the Westminster Abbey in December 1066. Many castles and forts were built by William or William the Conqueror to secure his now conquered lands in England. This is represented in the game with the civilization bonus network of castles, which grants attack speed to nearby units whenever enemies are in range. That bonus can be also improved to give units even more attack speed if the network of citadels is researched in any keep. The English civilization also has scary town centers that fire an extra arrow, and that's why you should always be cautious when you're going under an English TC. We can understand this mechanic in the game as cities and villages being reinforced with castles and keeps and towers due to the conquest of the Normans, or the Norman Conquest, better. Interestingly, the word Normans actually comes from Nor, from the north, and man, Norsemen. The northern area of France was settled by Vikings and legitimized when Rollo, a leader, agreed to an alliance with the French king of the time, Charles III, and he became the first ruler of Normandy after the siege of Paris in 885. If you watched the series Vikings, you can probably pick up something there. So let's stop to think a little bit about it. England was actually Britannia, belonging to the Roman Empire, and it was conquered by Norsemen and Germanic tribes, only to be reconquered by Norsemen living in the northern area of France, Normandy. So in the end, England is just Vikings as well. That's kind of the conclusion we can take from that. So the Feudal Age in the game represents the post-Norman Conquest period. And to go to the Feudal Age, you can build either the Abbey of Kings or the Council Hall. The Abbey of Kings heals nearby friendly units and allows the production of the king, a unique unit to the English. Or better yet, allows you to crown a king. The king is a unique unit of the civilization, and it's basically a knight, but capable of healing itself and units around him when out of combat. Your first king is crowned for free, and you can start harassing your opponent with him not long after aging up. You can quickly identify the king by the golden crown floating above the unit. This landmark is based on the Westminster Abbey in London, but of course a much older version of it. Historians agree that there was a monastery dedicated to Saint Peter in the area before, when a community of monks established themselves there. Edward the Confessor rebuilt the abbey to provide himself with a burial church. Edward the Confessor is remembered as a deeply religious and gentle king. He spent much time in prayer and was even canonized as a saint. He wasn't really into military and politics, so he would rather delegate to other people to do that job for him. And that, plus the unclear succession plans, led to crisis and the Norman Conquest. The foundations of Edward's Abbey can still be found under the current church, the present church. He and 3,000 other people were buried in the church, including Darwin, Hawking, and Newton. People actually could buy a burial spot in the church back in the days, but since the 19th century that's not possible anymore. Nowadays, the Abbey is an active church and one of the most important ceremonial spaces in the whole UK. Every British monarch since William the Conqueror has been crowned there. Beneath the coronation chair sits the Stone of Scone, also called Stone of Destiny, a sacred Scottish stone used during coronations. Originally, it was used at the monastery of Scone Abbey for Scottish kings' coronations, but it was stolen by Edward I in 1296. He brought it to Westminster Abbey as a symbol of English dominance and the union of Scotland and England. Union, right? Funny enough, in 1950, students stole it from the Abbey and returned it to Scotland. But it was actually brought back to England in 1953 for Elizabeth's II coronation. And in 1996, really recently, it was actually permanently returned to Scotland. It sits in the Edinburgh Castle. But they still share it and they send it back to London for any coronations. Another fun fact about the Abbey, a single anonymous soldier from the World War I is buried in the church, symbolizing all of those that died in the war. And no one, even royalty, is allowed to walk on top of his grave. The other landmark that you can build is the Council Hall. The Council Hall is like 2 archery ranges. It can produce any units from the archery range, but it produces 100% faster. In Feudal Age, the unique English unit, the longbowmen, becomes available and can quickly be produced from this landmark. So when you see your opponent making this landmark, you might expect some longbow rush. The longbowman is an archer with more range and damage than common archers, but they also come with a defensive paling ability that can stop and damage enemy cavalry. Longbow is actually the name of the bow that these English soldiers used to carry. These 1.8 meter long medieval longbows changed the outcome of many battles during the 100 Years' War, for example, against France. In real life, it was really hard for archers to fire multiple times, one time after the other. Bows were actually heavy and demanded a lot of energy to be fired, exhausting even the most experienced man. In fact, medieval English archers developed noticeable asymmetrical skeletons, and that's due to the fact of the many years of training with these heavy longbows. The repeated strain caused their drawing arms to get stronger and larger, changing even the bone structure from, the bones all around, from the back, on the shoulders, the whole bone structures, they are deformed in a way. Even their spine and the joints, you can see clear deformation due to the years of practicing with that heavy thing. Since longbows were so effective and cheap to produce, they became the backbone of England's military. And laws dating back to the 13th century required Englishmen earning more than £2 a year to own a longbow. And of course, males up to the age of 60, which is kind of rare for the time, they were expected to know how to use it. And that's why in the game villagers carried their little bows. Because every Englishman or woman, they should be able to use a bow. The Council Hall landmark is inspired by the Westminster Hall. Constructed in 1097 by William II, its purpose was to showcase the power of the Norman monarchy. It was used before to host banquets and even served some judicial purposes until the 19th century. But since the 20th century, it has been used as a venue for ceremonial funerals. The hammer beam roof was commissioned for Richard II in 1393, and it's considered the greatest creation of medieval timber architecture. Interestingly, the roof was built without nails. It's also said that the Westminster Hall is actually a house to many ghosts, including, for example, Anne Boleyn carrying her head in her arms, and even a black hooded monk that it can be seen in the ancient floors wearing a black hood and just gliding around the floor. Spooky. So William was crowned William I of England in 1066, and he transformed this hybrid Anglo-Saxon and Danish land into a Anglo-Norman land or kingdom. His reign, however, was of course not peaceful, and he fought rebellions his entire life until his death in 1087. He left 3 sons: Robert, who took over Normandy lands, William Rufus, who took over England as William II, and Henry, who was landless. He was left with nothing. Cool, Dad. Thanks. Besides the constant rebellions after the Norman Conquest that you can expect, many Anglo-Saxons, including nobles, they simply fled the country for Scotland, Ireland, or Scandinavia even. We have reports that in the 1070s, a fleet of 235 ships sailed for the Byzantine Empire. It was a popular destination for many soldiers actually, because the Byzantines were in need of mercenaries. When playing Byzantines in AoE4, you can actually hire these English mercenaries as longbowmen. Another important factor to talk about is how the Norman Conquest dramatically transformed the English society. William, for example, introduced the feudal system, and after confiscating all the English lands, he then granted them to his Norman lords and knights, creating a feudal hierarchy that was completely loyal to him. And in return for the lands, these lords owed him military service. His son, William II, was called William Rufus probably because of the color of his hair. He was known for his complex temperament, and he never married. Having a temperament and marriage probably don't go well together. But there were also some speculations regarding his sexuality. He is in general remembered as a very controversial ruler, with a reputation of arrogance and harshness and even anti-clerical, something that it wasn't common at the time at all. Well, his death is also questionable. Some say that he was actually murdered by his younger brother Henry, the Landless. We don't have any actual proof of that, but we do know that he was shot by an arrow when he was out hunting. And in the Anglo-Saxon chronicles, it says by one of his men. So that's all we know. Sadly, his body was left where he fell. I guess people just didn't care that much about him. Today, however, there is a memorial stone marking the place of his death, and it's called the Rufus Stone. In any case, Henry then rushes to London after his brother's death, and he is crowned Henry I of England. Henry, once landless, now is King of England. Henry was the most learned of William's sons. He could speak many languages, he was trained in law, governance, and administration. And that is because, as the youngest son, he was expected to fulfill more administrative roles under his brothers, who were supposed to be kings. He was also very promiscuous and had many illegitimate children with many partners, but with his wife Matilda of Scotland he only had 1 son and 1 daughter. His only son, however, William Adeline, died quite early, and Matilda was instead named heir of the throne. Henry even tried marrying a second time to, go for more children, but he wasn't successful. During the reign of Henry I, the Palace of Westminster was known as the King's Palace, and that was a royal residence but also an administrative center. Another element of the palace were towers and fortifications to protect the royal family, and the towers were used both as watch points and to store valuables, such as the Jewel Tower. And what am I talking about? I am talking about the landmark that you can build to go to the Castle Age, the King's Palace. This landmark is basically a town center, with all the texts that you can research and the bonuses. In the game's files, this landmark is called Westminster Palace, and I found concept designs for the landmark that confirm the inspiration behind it. We can see this landmark as the royal lodgings in the palace with its own treasury tower. What I realized here is that when playing English, you're actually building the Westminster Palace complex yourself, going for the Abbey, the Council Hall, and the lodgings. In any case, the palace complex looks nothing like it used to in the Middle Ages. It has been rebuilt and expanded many times throughout history following of course the architectural styles of each period. The other landmark is the White Tower. The White Tower is basically a keep that can produce units faster. The English civilization can produce units out of any keep, but from the White Tower they come faster. This landmark was based on the Tower of London, a keep that was built also for William the Conqueror as a symbol of power. Originally though, it was made of wood, and only in 1078 work began to transform it into a stone keep. At the time it was the strongest military point, but is still capable of accommodating royalty comfortably. The Norman architecture is actually Romanesque, meaning that they took inspiration from Roman architecture. In typical Norman keeps, the entrance is actually above the ground level and could only be accessed with wooden staircases, for example, and those could also be removed in the event of an attack. Another typical feature of this architecture style is the square tower, something we can also see in other landmarks based on buildings of the same period. The tower was used by Henry I as a treasury and a prison, but it was under Henry II that the tower was significantly expanded and partially rebuilt. That's also when the tower starts to be used officially as a state prison. Around this time also marks a significant turning point in history, as at the same time we have the beginning of the Crusades. Henry I's daughter, Matilda, was raised in Germany for a few years before marrying the Holy Roman Emperor Henry V. And she was only 12 years old while he was in his early 30s. She was, as we saw, heir to the English throne after her brother William Adeline died drowned. But it wasn't that simple. The church and the English lords, they just did not accept that. A woman ruling England, that's unacceptable. After her husband's death, she established herself in Normandy and kept calling herself Empress. Because why not? And she is known until today as Empress Matilda. She remarried, however, when she was 25 years old to Geoffrey Plantagenet, when he was 14 years old. Together they had a son, Henry II. After her father's death, Henry I, she was not crowned queen, but instead her cousin Stephen was crowned King of England. With her husband's support, she fought for her rights to rule.
And takes Stephen by surprise, and if he thinks he's fighting a spoiled princess, he's wrong.
And that's when we see the start of a long period of civil war and unrest in England called anarchy. England was divided between supporters of Matilda and Stephen. Her supporters, however, slowly diminished, as they either died or they went on crusades. She returned to Normandy in 1148, defeated, but her son, Henry II, took over the fight when he was 14 years old. Henry was actually successful and he managed to make a deal with Stephen. They settled on a treaty, the Treaty of Winchester, that says that Henry would be king after Stephen, so he would be the heir. And indeed, in 1154, Henry was crowned Henry II of England, and his mother was acting for him in Normandy, like a representative. Henry II is actually the first king of the Plantagenet dynasty, the bloodiest dynasty that ever ruled England. His territories included England, of course, and his mother's territories in France, forming the Angevin Empire. Now, I am going to skip quite a bit now because this part of history can be covered in another video for the Lancaster civilization. So we're just gonna kind of skip through a little bit. But the general idea is that the English civilization in the game is mostly inspired by the Norman Conquest and by the Normans. The structures, how they look like, the architecture, the Romanesque architecture and so on. The English are actually the Normans. And to reach the Imperial Age in the game, you can build either the Wingard Palace or the Berkshire Palace. The Wingard Palace landmark can train batches of units, but for less than half their total cost. And not only that, they can produce some unique units that cannot be produced from anywhere else, like the Wingard Footman and the Ranger. These units are better versions of the men-at-arms and the longbowmen. This landmark is based on the Hampton Court Palace. Originally, it was property of the Order of St. John of Jerusalem. I won't go into details here, but you would recognize this order if you played with the Knights Templar civilization, as their origins trace back to the Knights Hospitalier. But this content is for another video. So if you don't want to miss the next one, don't forget to subscribe, like the video, subscribe, and ring the bell, click the bell so you get the notification when the next video comes out. The palace was passed to Thomas Wolsey in 1514, who was a favorite of Henry VIII. Wolsey spent a fortune to build the finest palace in England, and little has changed since completed in 1525. The architecture of the palace shows a transition from the Tudor-influenced Gothic to the Italian Renaissance classical style, with a blend of both of them. Wolsey passed the palace to the king in 1530, who expanded then with huge kitchens, enough to serve his 1,000 people court. He also added a huge great hall and even a tennis court. The other landmark that you can build to go to the Imperial Age is the Berkshire Palace. This landmark is kinda like a keep, but it's equipped with incendiary arrows, serving both offensive and defensive purposes according to your position in the game. This landmark is based on the round tower of the Windsor Castle, which was another castle built by, you know who? William the Conqueror. The tower itself was built only by Henry II in the 1170s and was made atop an artificial hill, and its purpose was to serve as a stronghold and a lookout. In Imperial Age, you get access to enclosures, one of the farm's upgrades available only for the English in the Imperial Age. Enclosures was a term to refer to the appropriation of common land, which became widespread and systematic starting in the 16th century. The primary benefit of it was the increased value of their own land due to this appropriation, allowing lands to be sold, which were twice as valuable as free lands. And this allowed the farmers to consolidate and fence off their plots of land. Exactly how it looks in the game, isn't it? I think this explains why in the game enclosed farms are generating gold, and it's simply the value of the lands increasing over time. The Imperial Age in the game marks the transition to the Tudor era, after the War of the Roses, which mainly revolves around the York and the Lancaster houses. And the Lancaster is also a variant civilization of the English in the game, and I'm going to have a dedicated video for them as well, filling up a little bit of the history in between the castle and the Imperial Age, because it's exactly in between there. That's the Lancaster-York dispute that turns out into the Tudor era. Before we end this video, I want to talk about their wonder. In Imperial Age, you can build the wonder for a wonder victory. The English's wonder in the game is called Cathedral of St. Thomas and is based on the Canterbury Cathedral. In 596, Pope Gregory I had an idea. He sent a monk named Augustine from Rome on a mission to convert the Anglo-Saxons to Christianity. This whole project became known as the Gregorian Mission. According to the monk Bede, who wrote about this later, Augustine and his crew actually got the green light from the King of Kent to bring some old churches back to life. And just a year later, in 597, Augustine founded what would become one of the most important churches in England, the Canterbury Cathedral. One of the most dramatic moments in the cathedral history happened in 1170, when Archbishop Thomas Becket was murdered, right there and then, in the church, by knights from King Henry II. The two actually had clashed a lot. Becket was stubborn, and the king was, well, a king. And at some point, Henry supposedly burst out in frustration, saying, "Will no one rid me of this turbulent priest?" Well, 4 knights took that a little bit too literally. They rode to Canterbury and killed Becket inside the cathedral itself. and the game names the wonder after Thomas Becket, the Cathedral of St. Thomas. But that's all I have for you guys today. That was a long one. I am super tired and hungry right now. Thank you so much for watching. I hope you enjoyed. It was a very long time for researching this one, but that is because the material I have collected already is going to serve for the Lancaster civilization video, and also gives me some of content for the Templar civilization, which I think you guys are also looking forward. And I have already, you know, some little details that I collected from the Angevin Empire, from the Hospitalier, and so on. So stay tuned, like the video if you enjoyed, if you learned something new, subscribe to the channel, don't forget the notifications so you guys can get the alerts once these new videos also come out. Have a good one, bye bye.